start. Unfortunately, this building was put up in the 1950s when the architects only used right angles, and so we don't really have a round table, and I'm not quite sure I'm happy with this setup where we're confronting the audience like this. But maybe we can ignore the structural realities and engage our imaginations a bit and imagine that it is really a round table. So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this in the series of the CIUS seminars. The title, as you've seen in the posters, is Sovereignty and Sanctions, Disentangling the Canada-Russia-Ukraine Foreign Policy Triangle. The eternal triangle, or the ménage à trois, is familiar to all of us, at least from literature and drama, if not from real life. It's a very tricky relationship in which the main character has to keep the others happy, or ignorant of each other, or maybe they just play along and pretend they don't know. By analogy, the relationship between Canada, Russia, and Ukraine could be thought of in a similar way. Canada wants to be on good terms with the other two, but Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty brings Canada to impose sanctions on Russia. One of the questions is, are these having any effect on Russia's policies towards Ukraine? Another question would be, is Canada's support of Ukraine helping or merely aggravating the situation? Are Canada's sanctions worsening its own relations with Russia, which can and does challenge Canada's Arctic sovereignty? The Harper government, as we all saw, was very strong, at least rhetorically, in its support for Ukraine standing up to Russia. Another question then becomes, is there change now that we have a Liberal government led by Justin Trudeau? So these are among the questions to be addressed by our expert panelists this afternoon, to whom you've been introduced by the poster, so I'm not going to read that. I'll just say that as far as I'm aware, none of them is currently undergoing marital counseling. So we can, I think, depend on their answers to these and other questions being more from the point of view of public policy and foreign policy, and not so much from a purely domestic perspective. First, we'll hear from Ambassador Derek Fraser. Derek?
Oh, thank you very much, Bogdan. I am going to speak about what Russia's, if I can use the expression, war aims are. I'm going to say only one sentence about what Canada and Western countries policy should adopt towards Russia, but it's after an examination of what Russia is trying to accomplish. Since the end of the year, there's been a shift in tone in Russian-Ukrainian relations. At Russia's initiative, talks on the conflict in the Donbass between representatives of Russia, the Russian-supported rebels, the EU, and the United States have become more intensive. The purpose of the Russian push is to achieve the implementation on its terms of the Minsk II agreement of February 2015, which established the current, very poorly observed ceasefire. Both sides seek to exploit the ambiguities of Minsk II to their advantage. Russia wants an agreement on less than democratic elections for the Donbass, so as to give political legitimacy to their proxies, the rebels, and amendments to the Ukrainian constitution that would give full autonomy to a Russian-controlled Donbass. including the right to its own foreign trade policy and a veto on the foreign and domestic policy of Ukraine. Russia attempts to force Ukraine to acquiesce in these terms by making conditional on their acceptance Ukrainian control of the border with Russia and thus the withdrawal of the unacknowledged Russian troops. Ukraine, on its part, requires Russia first to withdraw Russian troops and weapons and to give Ukraine control of the border before elections are held or the amended constitution comes into force. Ukraine furthermore refuses to accept elections that are not held under Ukrainian law and organized by the Central Electoral Commission with the participation of all Ukrainian parties, all citizens of the area, total media freedom, and observed by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. There has never been any appetite in Ukraine for decentralization anywhere in the country. Just before the Russian-led uprising in the Donbass, decentralization enjoyed in the two parts of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Luhansk, the support of only a quarter of the population. The Ukrainian government is nevertheless supporting the revision of the constitution to permit the decentralization at the community level for the entire country. Local bodies would have responsibility for in areas such as health, education, culture, and public works. And a special status for the Donbass would only last 3 years. What Ukraine is prepared to do in constitutional reform, therefore, falls far short of what Russia requires. Furthermore, the Ukrainian government may not even have the political support needed to gain approval for this initiative. An amendment to the Constitution requires 300 votes in the Parliament, the Rada, in the second reading. On the first reading last August, the proposed amendment, however, obtained only 265 votes. There is a real danger that should President Poroshenko seek to push even the modest forms of decentralization that he proposes through the Rada right now, the government would be defeated, perhaps forcing early elections and the return of other powers to power. The reason for the renewal of the Russian diplomatic activity just now would appear to be the worsening economic situation in Russia, principally caused by the decline in the price of oil, which has forced Russia to seek to get rid of Western sanctions imposed as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. The problem Russia is facing is that in seeking to get rid of the sanctions, is that it has carried out almost none of the terms of the Minsk II agreement. Among other acts of non-compliance, it has not fully observed the ceasefire, it has not withdrawn its troops, it has not allowed international peace observers full access, it hampers international humanitarian organizations, it has blocked full exchange of prisoners and hostages. There is pressure on the Ukrainians as well. Western Europe is suffering from Ukraine fatigue. If it appears, and if at present it doesn't appear to be seen this way, that Putin is cooperating and Poroshenko is stalling in seeking a settlement, some EU countries may be eventually tempted to put an end to sanctions and to leave Ukraine to its fate. While Russia evidently wants to free itself from sanctions, therefore, there is nothing to suggest that Russia is prepared to surrender control of the Donbass or to accept the independence of Ukraine. There are two reasons for Russian reluctance to change course on Ukraine. First, the large and hostile demonstrations in Moscow and St. Petersburg in 2011-2012 that greeted Putin's return to the presidency led Russia to pursue more aggressively its policy of forcing the West to treat Russia again as a great power with a veto on issues of importance to her. Russia's belligerent foreign policy, especially her treatment of Ukraine, has led to popular approval for Putin reaching unprecedented heights. It is questionable whether, in the Kremlin's eyes, the danger of unrest arising from the worsening economic situation to which sanctions have contributed has reached the point where it counterbalances the domestic political damage that a Russian retreat on Ukraine would cause. Furthermore, for Russia, the abandonment of its Ukrainian ambitions would sound the death knell of its wider ambitions to be treated again as a great power. It is open to doubt that Putin is prepared to give up Russian goals. To understand the dilemma that Putin is facing, let us look in detail at Putin's foreign policy aims. Putin has been attempting both to obtain a veto over major aspects of European and East-West affairs, as well as to bring the former Soviet republics back under Russian control. Let us consider, first, Russia's efforts to get a veto. President Medvedev in 2008 proposed a European Security Treaty that would have devalued existing security arrangements such as the OSCE. These proposals would have also prevented NATO from acting independent of Moscow and any further former Soviet republics from joining NATO. Finally, the proposals would have weakened the independence of East European countries by dropping the OSCE principles of the inviolability of borders, non-intervention in internal affairs, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and equal rights and self-determination of peoples. Russia also proposed a union of Europe between Russia and the EU. The union would coordinate energy, military, political, and strategic matters. In October 2014, Foreign Minister Lavrov stated the agreement with the EU would be based on a system of indivisible security where no country could strengthen its security at the expense of others. Such provisions would prevent the EU from acting independently of Moscow or the other Soviet republics from associating with the EU. North America would be excluded from Europe. The Medvedev proposals apparently remain the basis of Russian policy. At the latest since 2012, there have been many Russian speeches and articles advocating a return to the Yalta-Potsdam or Cold War system of East-West relations in which the Soviet Union had its veto. In an article published in March 2016, Foreign Minister Lavrov stated, "During the last 2 centuries, any attempt to unite Europe without Russia and against it has inevitably led to grim tragedies. Not a single European issue can be resolved without Russia's opinion." Let us now examine Russia's attempt to bring the other former Soviet republics to heel. In August 2013, Ruslan Pukhov, the director of an institute close to the Ministry of the Defense, and the author of an authoritative study of the new Russian military doctrine, stated that in order to achieve the aim of the Russian national security doctrine for 2020, namely the renaissance of Russia as a great power, Russian dominance over the other former Soviet republics had to be restored. Russia could, if necessary, use force to achieve its objectives. The chief instrument for establishing Russian dominance is the Eurasian Economic Union of former Soviet republics. The EU is the latest in a series of attempts to re-establish Russian control in the former Soviet Union. The Russians hope that the EEU will grow into a geopolitical bloc with responsibility for collective security. A combination NATO and EU, if you will. For Russia, Ukrainian membership in the EEU is essential to the success of the organization. In September 2013, Putin's aide for the EEU, Sergei Glazyov, warned Ukraine that if it signed with the EU, the European Union, an association agreement, which would have prevented eventual Ukrainian membership in the EU, Russia might support secessionist movements in Ukraine. This was 6 months before the occupation of Crimea. During that autumn, Russia maintained its pressure on Ukraine. Eventually, the then Ukrainian President Yanukovych abandoned the EU agreement, the agreement with the European Union, and all but joined the predecessor to the Eurasian Economic Union, namely the Customs Union. His actions, of course, provoked the Maidan uprising, leading to his downfall. The overthrow of Yanukovych and the decision of the new government to sign the association agreement with the European Union, and perhaps its intention to apply again for NATO membership, led Putin to activate long-prepared plans to subjugate Ukraine. These plans go back at least to 2005. After seizing Crimea in February, Russia in April launched the secessionist movement in the Donbass. All but one of the principal leaders of the uprising were Russians. An influential voice in Russian foreign policy and a Kremlin advisor on Russia's relations with the other Soviet republics, Sergei Garaganov, stated at the time of the Russian seizure of the Donbass that Russia wants a united federative Ukraine if possible. Only this arrangement will maintain the formal integrity of the state. But Ukraine as a full-fledged state will be a distant historical memory. This scenario will ensure Russia's de facto dominance in the east and the southeast of Ukraine and semi-autonomy for the country's west. While Russia may have abandoned its ambition to carve out a Russian-controlled Novorossiya out of the southeast of Ukraine, there otherwise has been no indication of any change in Russian thinking since then. In a speech, and Russia's threat is not confined to Ukraine, in a speech on the 24th of October 2014, Putin declared that this Ukrainian civil war was an example of a conflict at the intersection of major states' geopolitical interests. And I think it certainly will not be the last without a series of clear agreements between Russia and the West. The Foreign Minister Lavrov added in the same month in another speech that Moldova and the Baltic states should consider events in Ukraine and draw conclusions. The Russian treatment of Ukraine may cast a light on Russian intentions for the other former Soviet republics. Russian statements on Ukraine and the other Soviet republics suggests that Russia considers that their statehood is contingent on their relationship with Russia. Since 2001, Russian law has allowed Russia to annex other states or territories. Since 2009, Russian law allows Russian armed forces to be used in support of Russian speakers abroad, one of the justifications for the invasion of Ukraine. It is also Russian policy to protect Russian compatriots abroad, another argument used for the attack on Ukraine. Under Russian law, since 1999, the term compatriot includes Russian citizens, former Russian citizens, and descendants of Russian citizens of the former Soviet Union and the Russian Empire. In other words, almost the entire population of all former Soviet republics, as well as the population of Poland and Finland. And Alaska, for that matter. There may be as well emerging a new Brezhnev doctrine. I think with the age of people here, I don't need to describe the Brezhnev doctrine, allowing military intervention against revolutions in Russia's neighborhood. The new military security strategy that President Vladimir Putin signed at the end of 2015 goes further than any other Russian official doctrines in treating allegedly foreign-instigated regime change in the near abroad as a security threat to Russia. Armed with these weapons, Russia does not hesitate to threaten its neighbors, especially the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Russia's Attorney General's office opened in the autumn of 2015 an investigation into the legality of the Baltic states' independence. At the same time, the Russian political analyst Rostislav Ishchenko, an associate of the Zborsky Club, a nationalist group with deep roots in the Kremlin, advocated in what other Russian commentators have described as a trial balloon, the preventive occupation of the Baltic republics. Russian pressure on the Baltic states is also physical. Russian forces have staged a raid on Estonia, to capture an Estonian security official. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has warned Latvia about its treatment of its Russian minority. Russian military aircraft violate the Baltic airspace. The Russian Navy harasses Lithuanian ships. In view of the deep differences on Europe between Russia and the West, there may be no quick or easy fix to the current East-West crisis. Under these circumstances, we must engage and pursue negotiations with Russia. At the same time, we must maintain robust sanctions against her and continue to strengthen NATO and maintain our support for Ukraine. Abandoning sanctions at this point, which could lead democratic Ukraine to fall, would not mean a return to normal relations with Russia. It might merely encourage Russia to act against other former Soviet republics. It might also provoke a movement of Ukrainian refugees to Western Europe that would rival that coming from the Middle East. And now, over to the rest of you.
Thank you very much.